Welcome to the Cultivation Cast with Black Dog LED and Alien Hydroponics. I'm here with Kevin, and we are here to cover a topic that is right on point for us, being lighting. We're here today to talk about intra-canopy lighting. But before we get started, I would recommend that if you have something you'd like to see us cover, something you'd like to see us talk about, please hit us up, let us know. You can email us at podcast@blackdogled.com, or just go through the contact form on our website. We always do love hearing from you and getting ideas for new topics. But again, today's topic is pretty straightforward. We do topics that have to do with environment and other things that are related to growing and lighting, but not necessarily directly lighting. Kevin and I have been following very closely the advent, I will say, of intra-canopy lighting. And I'll quickly define, for those of you that haven't heard the term, it's basically, nowadays they're calling any light like ours that goes above the canopy is top lighting. Intra-canopy is something that is in the canopy of lighting. Generally, it tends to be down near the bottom, below the canopy, pointing upwards, but they're playing with different design factors at this point.
And specifically, it's meant to go in between plants. So not strictly side lighting where you've just got lights on the walls aiming in, and it's not under canopy lighting where you've got a light aiming up. This intra-canopy lighting is meant to be in between plants.
It's often, they'll have a light with lights going both directions, so you could stick it down the middle and shine. They're trying different form factors. But the reason we want to talk about it is there's been, and I'm going to put up air quotes here for those of you that can't see me, research put out about intra-canopy lighting. We thought it was worth talking about it. This will be an intro because we're very curious to see where this goes over the next year or two. And there are very specific reasons why Kevin and I are not very impressed with the research so far. We would actually say a lot of the research is just marketing, somewhat couched as research because the numbers don't make sense entirely. So let's start talking just about, at a very high level, plants. What we're trying to do here is grow plants, all of us, right? Whether it's us trying to design the lights or you buying the lights trying to grow something. So let's get Kevin to explain a little bit to us about something that is interesting to me that's a part of this, which is phototropism and how plants move and contract to follow light, and also how they've evolved to take light from above. And let's talk a little bit about that. And then we'll go into some of the details about some of the research, again, air quotes, research we've seen put out about intra-canopy lighting. But Kevin, I think the first question, just anyone that's used to growing plants, we all know the sun's up above. Plants have evolved to accept light from above and take in that light, maybe not directly above always at noon, but kind of from the upper portion. And how is it that intra-canopy lighting could work, or could it cause problems with that? Or let's just talk at the high level about the plants. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, different plants behave differently. So there are plants out there that basically don't move their leaves very much at all in response to light. When they first grow, they aim themselves towards the average direction of the light they see, and then they stop moving and they just stay there for the rest of that leaf's life. Then there are plants that actually will move their leaves throughout the day in response to the direction the light is coming. So as the sun is going through the sky, the leaves will actually aim towards the source of the light. There's even interesting plants out there. There's one called a telegraph plant that will wiggle its leaves around, basically looking to see, hey, if I move over a couple inches, do I see more light? And so these things don't necessarily move quite fast enough to be perceived directly by the human eye, but if you do a time lapse of them, it becomes very obvious that some leaves are moving quite a bit, trying to find the light all the time. So there's different kinds of plants out there, different strategies they have.
Let me ask you real quick. We have a beautiful garden out there. For those of you that follow our social media, you'd see we've got a huge office garden outside of vegetables and produce that we love growing every summer. And one of the things Kevin likes to throw out there is a sunflower. And I've always been curious, is it called a sunflower because the flower tracks the sun, or does it just look like a sun?
No, while the flower is trying to be actively pollinated, it will actually track the sun. So it will aim east in the morning, and it will aim south. If you're in the northern hemisphere, it will aim south at noon, and it'll aim west in the afternoon. It literally tracks, the flower tracks the sun throughout the day, not because the flower is photosynthesizing itself, but because it wants to warm the flower up as much as possible to help get the fragrance that the flower is generating out there, which sunflowers don't have much of a fragrance that we can smell, but the bees are all that matter as long as they're the ones that see this nice, warm, inviting, huge flower head. They come to it and pollinate it.
So plants are aware of the sun and where the light's coming from.
Absolutely, and different plants, as I mentioned earlier, have different strategies. Some just keep their leaves kind of static. Others will move their leaves throughout the day.
Got it. So how do you feel about now let's go into it. We're in a grow room without the sun. We've got top lighting or our lights above. You stick a light below. What happens then? Does it confuse the plant? Can it photosynthesize from the bottom of the leaves? What are your thoughts on that? I know that this is all new and this is, because of LEDs, we couldn't do intra-canopy lighting with HPS. LED is all, we'd all have our grows burning down. Those of you that agree with HPS know you couldn't stick a bulb between your plants. So this is all really new ground, but based on your knowledge, do you feel that it's going to work at all as a strategy for generating more or stimulating more photosynthesis?
So again, there's all sorts of different plants out there. So a lot of plants will have a leaf where the underside of the leaf is actually a different color than the top side of the leaf. And there's a variety of different reasons why they do that, but a lot of the times the leaf will be darker, or a lot of them will be purple underneath. And that is not ideal, obviously, for absorbing light from underneath the leaf. So also different plants have different thicknesses of leaves. The stomata, the actual openings where the plant exchanges with the atmosphere carbon dioxide and oxygen, those tend to be on the underside of leaves. So there are definitely potential consequences to having light coming from the underside of a leaf instead of from the top. And clearly in nature, it is very uncommon for leaves to be receiving light from underneath. Now that being said, for plants like cannabis, for example, that have relatively thin leaves, if you look through a cannabis leaf at a bright light source, you'll notice that, most of the light is actually traveling right through the leaf. So it doesn't matter too much for plants with thin leaves, whether the light is coming from the top or the bottom. It probably doesn't make too much of a difference, although obviously the plant evolved to get light from overhead, so it's probably always going to do better with the light coming from overhead as opposed to underneath. Also, plants will, and again, different plants behave differently here, but for the most part, plants will always grow their stems towards the light. They don't want to ever try and grow into an area where they're not getting as much light. So the growth of the whole stem in general is always aiming towards the light. And if you've got light coming from underneath and no light from up top, that can cause some plants to definitely grow very oddly. And again, different plants behave differently. I've been growing indoors with artificial lights for long enough that, I've had fluorescent tubes that the plant just keeps growing up past the fluorescent fixture and just keeps growing normally. The leaves up above where they're not getting light are not as happy, obviously, but it will just keep growing. It's not like it tries to then aim itself back under the fluorescent fixture, but then other kinds of plants will. A lot of vining plants will overshoot the fixture and see, oops, I'm not seeing light up here, and then they'll I don't know that they're actively going down as much as gravity is taking the stem down because it's not pushing itself up anymore because it's not getting any more light, but they'll quote unquote find the light again that way. So wide variety of different plants, different strategies that have evolved over the millions of years plants have been around. So different plants definitely behave differently. But one thing that is not very common in nature that you see plants doing is plants getting light from the side. Typically the leaves are oriented towards the light source, so they're putting the flat side of the leaf towards the light source to absorb as much as they possibly can. There are some plants in desert areas that actually will fold their leaves up during the hottest part of the day so that they don't overheat and don't lose too much water, and then they will unfurl their leaves and try and collect as much light as they can during the morning and evening periods where it's not as hot and they're not losing as much water. So there's tons of different kinds of plants out there.
All right, so we know that there is a chance the plants can utilize the light from below. How much it might confuse or cause challenges with the growth patterns remains to be seen, it sounds like, specifically with cannabis as that. But as you and I have been talking about, one of the reasons we wanted to cover this topic today for the viewers is we've seen a big push, and I would call it more marketing than research. And the reason is there's been studies, quasi-studies put out where they've used intracanopy lighting and seen an increase in flower production. The problem is, nowadays we know that you can put quite a bit of light, and the amount of light that's being generally accepted to put above a canopy, let's say specifically for cannabis, has been going up as technology has been progressing with LEDs and as research has been progressing. So now the general research is, you can definitely go well above 1,000, 12, 1,300 ppft, even up to 1,800. The problem with the research, for cannabis specifically here, and again, there are issues with certain strains can't take it, and the spectrum does matter. A red heavy spectrum, you can't hit it quite as hard if you don't have a well-balanced spectrum. There are nuances to that, but you can use a good amount of light. And the reason I bring that up is the research or studies they're trying to put out about this intracanopy lighting, they will simply say, we had this grow, we have lights above it, and then we took either part of it or the whole thing and ran it with intracanopy and see if they saw an increase in flower production. What they fail to mention most of the time, or all the time that I've seen at this point, is how much light was above to begin with. So I don't think Kevin and I would debate if you had a grow that was underlit and I throw more light into the intracanopy lighting, yes, yields should go up if I had a deficit of light.
Well, I mean, it's always the case up to a point that adding more light is going to increase your yield up to a point. Once you get above 1,800, we've seen some studies showing that above 1,800, you might still see an increase in yield, but not at the same rate as increasing light up to 1,800 ppfd. But I have seen studies with intracanopy lighting where they did specify the amount of top lighting the plants were getting. I have not seen any where they were trying to give 1,800 ppfd from the top lighting and then add intracanopy lighting to see how that affects it.
What's the highest you've seen them start with for top lighting before they added intracanopy? I mean, even 1,000 even? I don't think I've
ever seen any over 1,000.
Yeah, so one of the theories we have is that, yes, if I wanted to design a study to show that intracanopy offered a flower benefit, I would simply start with something 800 to 1,000 or even potentially lower light levels. And then by adding intracanopy lighting, as Kevin said, the plant has the bandwidth to take in more light. And if I give it more light, it will grow more flower, which to all of us, it sounds great.
Well, and it should also be pointed out that there are always going to be cases where intracanopy lighting is going to be beneficial. Even if you have 1,800 ppfd at the top of your canopy, if your canopy is 10 feet thick, yeah, I guarantee that adding intracanopy lighting will increase your yield because you're not getting light penetration from the top down through a dense 10-foot thick canopy. So there's always going to be cases where it definitely, unequivocally is beneficial.
Yeah, and we will get to, there are use cases, and we could talk about, especially if we get outside of cannabis and we broaden that a little bit, there are cases you could speak about where intracanopy could make a lot of sense, and we'll go into those. But for now, if we say low light, I add light, I'm gonna get more yield, for sure. Our big question is if you started with an appropriate, and again, I'm putting up air quotes because that's different for different people and the strains and their growing style maybe, but if you started with what we would consider high or appropriate light, meaning the plants are not necessarily needing or they've got an abundance of light to work with, would there be any benefit to adding intracanopy light? And our belief is no, not necessarily. Now, there are caveats to that.
If you start with an appropriate but not a maximized amount of top lighting, then yeah, you're still going to see a benefit to intracanopy lighting. I think the question would be better worded as, does it make more monetary sense to add more light from the top or from intracanopy lighting? Which one gives you the bigger bang for the buck?
That's it. And so when we start talking, that's where I was going, is monetary. There is something to talk about there. So there's two things of monetary, right? There's the cost of the lights, the equipment you're buying. There's a hard cost to that. Every light you buy costs money. Everything you install costs money. And then you got to have AC to cool it. So we all know that. Then there's the cost. If you're an actual grower, especially in a commercial setting, you understand There's something we have to do every cycle. Growing cannabis is fun. The part not everybody talks about is the resetting of the rooms and getting ready for the next crop. There's a lot of cleaning that goes on in a commercial cannabis grow, especially in between runs. So when you empty a room and you harvest, you've got to clean the room out, get all the plant material out. Then you need to clean it. Then you should sterilize it and then reset it for your next grow, right? Well, part of that is cleaning all the surfaces. Cleaning a bench, it's possible. It's a little bit of work, but it's very feasible, and you scrub it and get your chemicals and do that thing. However, now if I've got a bunch of lights with all these surfaces that I need to keep clean, and if you've grown cannabis and had anything that's in the canopy, you know it gets coated in the sticky trichomes that we're trying to all grow. So now I've got lights in the canopy that once I take those plants out, those lights all need to be clean and sterilized. Yes, to be appropriate for the intracanopy, they're going to be somewhat waterproof. So yeah, you can clean them relatively easily and that you don't have to worry about spraying them down, but you do have to clean them. And there is, again, a cost associated with that. Just like buying the fixtures, you now have the cost of cleaning them in between each run.
It's not just the cleaning, though, that the physical presence of intracanopy lighting affects. The physical presence of a bar, most of these lights are designed as bars, as Noah said earlier. Oftentimes they'll have light shining out both sides of the bar, but that bar is blocking airflow. It's blocking access to the plants. You can't access everything as easily. And besides airflow, it's actually blocking light from up above. So any light that happens to come through the canopy from up above and hit that bar is now blocked and is not useful to the plants. So there's definitely a physical cost associated with, in the growing environment, associated with putting in intracanopy lighting. And again, if you've got a ridiculously tall plant and the top lighting is not penetrating, yeah, then adding intracanopy lighting is always going to be a benefit in terms of yield because you're getting more light down low, just makes sense. But if you're adding a intracanopy bar at a level in the canopy where the top lighting light levels are higher than what the intracanopy bar is actually putting out, it's a net negative. You're actually blocking more light than it's putting out. So it can actually be harmful.
And waste light, that's an excellent point. And I thought you'd touch on it there because you do all of our engineering on our lights. Every light bar you stick in there is going to be LEDs, contrary to some people's belief, still put off some heat. And if you have enough bars in there, you're going to create some interesting microclimates inside of your canopy where it's hard to deal with them. It's hard to get air movement in there.
And it should be pointed out that these bars are not tiny things because they have to be passively cooled, because you can't just have them overheating and starting a fire in a canopy. The heat sink or the surface of these bars has to be big enough to dissipate all the heat and ensure that they keep at a temperature low enough that they're not going to damage plants if a leaf rests against the bar, which is going to happen if it's intracanopy lighting. So you're probably going to have to keep the bar under 120 degrees or so, because anything more than that, you're going to start seeing leaves get damaged. And if it's significantly more than that, you might actually start creating a fire hazard. So most of these, not most, every intracanopy bar I've seen that is at least certified as being safe is very low power density. If you look at the amount of wattage that is being put out as light from the bar compared to the size of the fixture is absolutely huge compared to other fixtures that are designed for top lighting, where they can put bigger heat sinks in, where they can let the heat sinks get warmer because it's not going to cause a problem with fire hazards.
Gotcha. So when we're talking about bang for your buck, you're really kind of getting ripped off of the intracanopy lighting, that you're buying a lot of light, a lot of volume, but getting very little light out of it.
Let's put it this way. In terms of photon output per dollar, I have not yet seen a single intracanopy fixture that is cheaper than the same company's top lighting fixtures.
Gotcha. Easier to engineer that.
Yeah.
Something that sits above. So as we mentioned, we have our doubts, and that's what you're hearing about. We're not saying intracanopy doesn't work or that it's a non-starter. We're just curious to see where it goes because of this. Now let's talk about where it could make sense. One of the things we talk about a lot with ours is canopy maintenance. When you have our lights and when you're working with top lights, managing your canopy is incredibly important. Having a level canopy so you're not shadowing different parts of it is important. That's why we strive to get very even lighting levels when we set up lights in a facility. So part of that, though, that canopy management is not having too deep of a canopy. Growing a 6-foot tall plant with a 4-foot deep canopy inside is a recipe for disaster. Why? You're never going to get light through 4 feet of plant material, and you're just inviting opportunities for bugs and disease and molds and mildew and a lot of that stuff. So we want the canopy kept more manageable. If you did grow a very deep, very thick canopy, as Kevin was saying, there could be an opportunity to deploy intra-canopy lighting. But again, now you've got areas that are dense, thick, that don't move air and moisture effectively, and you're sticking a heat source in there. So we're not so sure that's a great approach either, but you could justify it.
It does depend on the particular morphology of the plant. So if the canopy is dense with leaves, then yeah, 4-foot thick canopy is not going to be good. If it's a very leggy plant, then 4 feet might not be too dense, and that might not be too bad, actually. So it depends on the structure of the plant involved. And different kinds of plants obviously make a difference here, because some plants, such as cucumbers and tomatoes, are naturally vining plants. They naturally just want to grow up and not as much bushy. So when they're grown commercially in greenhouses, they tend to just be put on a string, a trellis, and encouraged to grow up. And for example, with tomato plants, you'll often see a 6 or 8 foot tall section of the tomato vine, which is actively producing. And so you're trying to get light into this 6 or 8 foot tall plant. And there's a couple ways you can do that in a greenhouse. One is you space your rows far apart so the light can get in between the rows, and that obviously works, but it's not as space efficient as if you provide something like intra-canopy lighting between the rows. And that's where it could actually make a lot of sense. If you're trying to grow much more densely in a greenhouse for cucumbers or tomatoes, intra-canopy lighting definitely could make a lot of sense. Now again, you still have to actually do the calculations to figure out, hey, is this light bar actually blocking more light from up above than it's putting out? Because there's definitely a point where the light, the intra-canopy light, is going to hurt you instead of help you there.
So when we deal with something very far away, as we always say, you don't want to light with artificial light something far away, because we have the inverse square law of light. We lose so much as we get further. It spreads out really. So if that's happening, what you're saying is when we get a plant that's maybe 15 feet long vine, just lighting it solely from the top isn't the best strategy. Getting more targeted makes a little more sense, which explains why you and I, even though, yes, we spend a lot of our time in cannabis, we do deal with other plants as well, and we are seeing a lot of this intra-canopy lighting aimed at the cucumber market and things like that, and that maybe makes more sense than cannabis.
Yeah, it definitely depends on the crop, because with tomatoes, for example, they put out their flowers on the new growth, and then they keep growing new growth, taller, but the flowers start maturing into fruit as they get, quote unquote, further down the vine, which may or may not be moving. In commercial greenhouses, it's actually very interesting. If you've never seen how tomatoes are grown in commercial greenhouses, at least some commercial greenhouses, they'll actually put a spool of string up at the top of the greenhouse and attach the tomato vine to it. And as the tomato vine grows, they let more string out. So the tomato actually thinks it's growing taller, but what ends up happening is its stem ends up coiling up on the ground as it keeps growing. So they keep the active fruiting portion of the tomato vine at a convenient height for workers to come in and pick. Kind of an ingenious way of growing them, but essentially the fruiting area of the plant is always at a particular height above the ground, even though the vine thinks it's continuing to grow taller. It's not actually getting further from the ground.
So called a treadmill for tomatoes.
Yes, yes. So for crops like that, intra-canopy lighting definitely could make a lot of sense. And one thing to note there is I'm talking about indeterminate tomatoes, those that keep flowering and keep fruiting, rather than doing one big flush of flowers and ripening all their fruit at once. So tomatoes fall into two different categories, both the indeterminate that keep flowering and fruiting for as long as you can keep the plant happy and alive. And then there's determinate varieties that behave more like cannabis, where they get to a stage in their life that they decide I'm going to just go all out, do all my flowers and all the fruit all at once, and then they die. And that's what cannabis does. So when we're looking specifically at cannabis, you always can get a higher yield per square foot by having really big, massive plants, a really thick canopy, a really tall plant. I mean, we've all seen pictures of the types of plants they grow outdoors in the Emerald Triangle in California, absolutely huge cannabis trees. Now, you can get a huge yield per plant, a huge yield per square foot that way as well. But you also have to take into account the amount of time that it took in there. Because if you're growing cannabis plants outdoors, you only get one crop per year. If you're growing them indoors under artificial light, you have a choice. You could veg your plants for a really long time, get really huge plants, put in tons of intra-canopy lighting, and yes, you could get off the charts levels of grams per square foot of yield. But if you run the numbers and figure out, okay, for the space, for the room that I have, does that, one really big harvest match up with the 5 harvests I could have done in the meantime if I only vegged for a couple of weeks and flowered the plants when they were smaller? So that very much comes into account when you're talking specifically about cannabis. And that's where I also question the sense of intra-canopy lighting when it comes to cannabis. Yes, if you're growing a really tall plant and you're vegging it for a really long time, then yes, it makes sense to have intra-canopy lighting so you can put your plants in more densely and get a higher yield per square foot. But if you look at the numbers and say, well, if I only vegged for a couple of weeks instead of 4 months, then you could have had another couple of harvests in that time. And so the numbers probably don't flush out that well, regardless of the amount of intra-canopy lighting you add. I'm still going to bet that you could do better by harvesting smaller plants and growing smaller plants for a shorter period of time to begin with.
And having an appropriate amount of top lighting to begin with, yeah. So that is the critical part that we keep coming back to, is that if your grow room, your flower room was set up with adequate lighting to begin with, the real gist of what we're saying is we don't necessarily believe adding intra-canopy would be worth the benefit, the cost benefit, right? There's going to be money to install it, money to purchase it, money to install it, and then money to maintain it and clean it between runs. If you add all that up, as Kevin's saying, does it flush out and make financial sense?
And that is something I have never seen even mentioned, let alone tracked in any of these so-called research studies on the benefits of intra-canopy lighting.
Yeah, and one of our team members here at Black Dog worked at a commercial grow. If you've had a chance and you've been lucky enough to talk to Jay, he used to work on a commercial grow on the grow side. And right before he left there, they were trying intra-canopy lighting, and they came to that conclusion that it really wasn't worth the extra added work and effort that went into it. Just put the right lighting above. So that's part of it, is really getting set up correctly to begin with, and determining what that optimal lighting level is for your grow, whether it's 1200 or 1400 or 1000 or 16. That's really dependent on the grower, the growing style, the specific strains you're growing. But again, getting that optimal lighting level to begin with is important, but we are very curious to see where this goes. I would be curious, and we'll never know this, the strategy of some of these companies. We've seen many products move from the larger agriculture space, like tomatoes and cucumbers, and they look at cannabis and say, oh, there's a ton of money. Those cannabis growers, they have money. Let's go get some of their money. And they try to move products over here, even if they don't make sense. And part of our suspicion is, yes, as Kevin pointed out, there is a very practical use case for intra-canopy lighting in certain crops. We are just not convinced it's appropriate for cannabis. And like you, we're going to keep an eye on the space and see if it starts to make sense. But we believe if you have a properly lit grow and a properly maintained canopy, as Kevin's saying, taking into account things like speed of veg and all of that, that there's probably not a lot of benefit to the intra-canopy lighting because of all the stuff that comes along with it, the costs and workload associated with it. Again, for cannabis. We would not deny that there are definitely good use cases for intra-canopy lighting. But we thought it would be interesting to talk about because there's more and more talk, there's companies pushing it, and we don't like to see people push with products that we feel are inappropriate, and we're not sure this is appropriate yet, so we thought it'd be good to get out, give some thoughts, some things to think about if you're going to try intra-canopy. If you're a commercial grow and you're interested in trying it, it's like everything else. We would suggest a real legitimate test. But again, when you look at that test, do you say, okay, I've got my room right now at 900 ppfd and I want to test intra-canopy? Would you be better off doing a 3-leg test where you test intra-canopy at 900, but then you also do another room where you add more top lighting and don't put intra-canopy in? So you have one at your lower light level by itself as a control, one with intra-canopy, and then one where you don't do intra-canopy, but you add the same amount of energy up above in a fixture that, as Kevin was explaining, is actually more efficient at putting out light. So we would say to really test it with a mind thinking, okay, there's different ways to increase yield with light. There's a lot of ways to increase yield in your grow. We couldn't even touch them all in one podcast, no matter what. But strictly from a lighting standpoint, if you're trying to maximize yield with lighting, there's a few ways to do it. Increasing lighting is one of them. However, you could put it intra-canopy, you could put it on top. So if you were going to entertain this, I would suggest looking at all of those options and say, hey, I could put more light in, but there is the option to put more light above.
And if you are going to do your own test, which again, we always encourage, we love doing our own experiments. If you are putting more intra-canopy light in and you determine that, hey, I can grow a thicker canopy with this, awesome. That's going to increase your yield per square foot. But you also have to then account for the additional time that it took for that to grow and work out the numbers there to figure out not just your yield per square foot, but your yield per square foot per year. Because just looking at yield per square foot isn't going to give you the full picture.
Yeah, no, definitely not. But it is an interesting subject and one we plan to keep an eye on, and we will do a follow-up in the future just to kind of see where we see the research going. But we hope you found this discussion interesting.
Yeah, and just fun reminiscence from college days. I remember people growing pot plants in their college dorm room closets and adding, typically this was done with street lights that they stole from parking lots. Very, very safe things going on back then. And I remember at least a couple of people going out and buying strings of Christmas tree lights, which I'm old enough that Christmas tree lights did not exist as LEDs. They were all incandescent back then. But they figured they'd increase the amount of light their plant was getting under this stolen HPS that came out of a parking lot by buying a string of Christmas tree lights and wrapping it around the plant. And they were actually creating more shadow and blocking more light than the string of Christmas tree lights ever could have possibly added. So that's my earliest recollection of people, quote unquote, experimenting with intra-canopy lighting. And I only know of a few fires that got started because of things like that.
So there's your key takeaway. Christmas tree lights in your canopy, not a good idea. No. The other thing, if you've been around long enough, growers are very interesting in that they try to solve many problems in a creative way. And if you've been around long enough, you might remember, for those of you that have been growing for a while, cool tubes where they were sticking HPS bulbs in a glass jacket and hanging them vertically in their grow. We've seen a lot of that. Not the safest thing, and just a recipe for hospital visits.
Well, and even though the cool tube was able to extract the heat that was coming off of the bulb directly, the HPS light still put off enough infrared light that we perceive and plants perceive as heat that it would still burn leaves if they got close enough to it, which for a 1,000-watt HPS bulb was still a few feet away. So
yeah, interesting solution. So we will definitely do a follow-up to this and tell you what we see and what we find and what we learn along the way. But I hope you enjoyed this quick discussion regarding intra-canopy lighting. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also follow us on our social media. Great way to stay abreast of what we're doing over here. And again, if you have any questions or thoughts on what you'd like us to cover, please don't hesitate to reach out to podcast@blackdogled.com or hit us up through our website. Thanks for joining us, and happy gardening.